There is in your computer. You just see, yeah, every web
Okay, great.
on YouTube.
So, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Actually, good afternoon or good night, depending on which part of the world you are right now. So let's cover everyone. It's a pleasure to start our third day of this event. That's very nice so far. And it's a pleasure today to present Professor Marcel Brass. Marcel is Einstein's strategic professor at the School of Mind and Brain, Department of Psychology of Humboldt University in Berlin. Before that, he worked for 14 years as a research professor at Ghent University in Belgium, where he directed the Center for Cognitive Neuroscience. And his research interests are cognitive intentional control of behavior, the influence of free will beliefs on basic social cognition, imitation and social cognition, and methodologically, he works with basically all cognitive neuroscience methods, EEG, fMRI, TMS, and mental chronometry. I could go on forever here with Marcel's CV, but he asked me just to present this basics. But before passing the word to him, I also have to say that apart from all of this, Marcel is one of the most generous and empathetic persons I have ever met in academia. And it's no wonder that apart from all this free will work that you can't do any free will work without bumping into his name in papers. But apart from all of this, he's such an empathetic guy, and that it's no wonder he has done such a fantastic job, such fantastic work on social cognition and imitation as well. So Marcel, I have to thank you very much for accepting to be here. It is a pleasure, and we're very anxious to hear from you.
Okay, thanks Renato for this very nice introduction. And thanks the organizers and also you, Renato, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be in Brazil, even though only virtually. I always wanted to come to Brazil since I know you, and I hope that in winter it will be in person rather than only virtually. I have to say, Renato spent some time in Ghent with me. Unfortunately, then I was already moving to Berlin, so we only spent a few months together, and that also under COVID conditions. But it was really a very nice experience to work together with Renato. Furthermore, I would like to apologize for the very complicated title. It's really difficult to follow. I hope that my talk will be a little bit easier to digest, I have to say. Okay, but now I will dive into the topic. The fundamental aspect of our sense of agency and control is the subjective experience of choice. So in our daily life, we permanently have to make choices, important ones. For example, whom we marry, whether we buy a house or not, very important in Belgium, by the way, but also less important ones. So for example, whether we buy a pizza or pasta in a restaurant. And usually, these choices come together with a specific experience, namely that we can freely decide what to do. We can make conscious decisions. In a restaurant, I can choose to take a pizza rather than a pasta. And of course, we know that we are not completely free. So for example, when I'm with my wife in a restaurant, we usually negotiate who orders what because we share the meal. So there is some external influence. But nevertheless, we have the experience that at the end of the day, we can decide on a lot of things. So this is very important, as I said, for our experience of agency and free will. However, this intuition of conscious free will has been challenged. And it has been challenged both by philosophy and neuroscience. And I would like to briefly outline these challenges. First of all, there is a challenge by philosophy, which is called causal determinism. And this challenge simply says, every event is determined by previous events and the laws of nature. So in principle, my decision in the restaurant, in the Italian restaurant, to order pizza is already determined since the Big Bang, or even before, I don't know. This is an idea that is around for quite a while and has been discussed in philosophy a lot. But honestly, I don't think that it had a lot of influence on people on the street, so to say, because it runs so dramatically against our intuition and is so abstract that I don't think that anybody ordering a pizza considers that this choice might have been determined already billions of years ago. But there is a kind of light version of this determinism, which you can call neural determinism. And neural determinism is a little bit easier to digest. And neural determinism claims that our conscious decisions are determined by unconscious brain activity preceding our decisions. So in other words, there are unconscious brain processes that already determine what we are going to do, and we only become aware of this later on retrospectively, so to say. So these brain processes determine whether we choose a pizza or pasta. And this neural determinism seemed to be much easier to digest than causal determinism because it made it into the public media. People seem to be more convinced by this kind of argument. So you can find articles over the last, let's say, 2 or 3 decades in public media that pick up neuroscientific findings and then ask questions like this one. Why don't we really have free will? Or here from the Scientific American, how free is your will? So it looks as if, in principle, this neural determinism has a potential to really change people's beliefs about free will, which raises an interesting question. Namely, does it really matter whether we believe in free will? So you could argue, who cares if people start to believe that free will is an illusion? Will that really change their behavior? And here again, we have a philosophical literature and a more psychological literature. And the theoretical ideas about this come in 3 flavors. So first of all, you have the idea that it doesn't matter. So if people start to believe that free will is an illusion, that wouldn't matter because this intuition of free will is so strongly rooted in our behavior and emotions that we won't behave differently anyway. And this was already put forward by David Hume a few hundred years ago. So he says, don't care, doesn't really matter. People won't change their behavior because this free will idea is so ingrained. But we have other positions. And one of this is by Saul Smilansky. And he argues that it would be catastrophic if people would disbelieve in free will, because this would completely undermine our moral intuitions. So it would lead to a complete change of behavior and would be catastrophic for our society. And then there's another position which also assumes that it matters whether we believe in free will or not. And one of the proponents of this view is Dag Perreboom. And he argues it would matter, but it would be positive because people would give up on ideas like retributive punishments that are stupid anyway. So it would have positive consequences for our society. Now, these are theoretical positions. I'm a psychologist, so I'm primarily interested in empirical findings. So the question is, what does empirical research tell us about this question? Does it matter whether people believe in free will or not? And here we have a literature that is relatively young, 10 to 15 years. And the first studies that came out by Roy Baumeister and Kathleen Voss seem to suggest that disbelief in free will has a very negative effect on social behavior. So if you prime people with this belief in free will, they start to behave antisocially, they cheat more, they become more aggressive. So very much in line with the idea of Spinansky. There are some problems with replicating some of the findings, though, one has to admit. Nevertheless, I think there is some literature out that suggests that free will beliefs might be related to social behavior. Me and my group, we have also done some research where we looked at disbelief in free will and whether it has an impact on more basic motor and social cognitive functions. And because at the moment, there's a European Championship in football in Europe, I would like to briefly report a study in which we investigated whether disbelief in free will changes the way we attribute intentionality to other people. And I would like to start with a video of an Argentinian football player. I'm sorry for the Brazilians, but it doesn't show him in the best light, I have to admit. You know this guy here? This is a quarterfinal of the World Championship 1986. Now watch Diego Maradona.
Certainly it's been true of the England team. Seen that much of hard jaw Trevor Stephen. Maradona just walked away from Hoddle then. Maradona.
So he scores a goal.
The ball came back off the foot of Steve Hodge. And Maradona.
The English players start to complain.
The England players protesting to the referee. But the little man who started it by walking past Glenn Hoddle, that's where the ball came from Hodge. Maradona had continued the run forward. And the goal is given.
So the goal is given. Afterwards, as you can see in this photo from a different perspective, one can see that Maradona pushed in the ball absolutely intentionally. So there was no doubt about that. Afterwards, he said, no, it wasn't me, it was the hand of God who was pushing the ball. A nice spin to the whole story. But starting from this idea, this football idea, whether a football player uses hand intentionally, we designed an experimental study or a study. So in football, as you might know, if there is a handball, the crucial question is whether it was intentional or accidental. And referees are trained on that. And we got hold of some of the training videos of the Swiss Referee Confederation or something like that, in which these videos are shown to referees, and they have to decide whether the ball was an intentional or an unintentional handball. And we showed these videos to normal participants and then asked them whether they think that the handball was intentional or not. And they responded on this Likert scale. They either strongly agreed or disagreed that it was an intentional handball. And then we correlated these ratings with a free will belief scale. And what we found was that indeed, there is a positive correlation between belief in free will and perceived intentionality. So people who strongly believe in free will tend to attribute more intentionality to observed behavior. And we showed similar results with completely different paradigms. So it looks as if indeed there is at least a correlation between free will beliefs and perception, social perception. So to conclude this part, it looks as if it really matters whether people believe in free will or not. So it looks as if it changes their social behavior if they disbelieve in free will, and might even change basic social perception. So this seemed to be really relevant in a way. Now, in the beginning, I showed you that indeed the message from neuroscience seemed to reach people on the street, so to say. It can convince people that free will is an illusion, and it seemed to matter for their behavior. So this raises another very crucial question, namely, how strong is the neuroscientific evidence that free will is an illusion? So if it is really true that this is the case, okay, then it is the case. But is there really very strong evidence for the point that free will is an illusion? And this is what I would like to discuss in the next 30 to 35 minutes. And before I start going into the in-depth discussion, I need to introduce the seminal experimental paradigm by Benjamin Libet, who kicked off in principle this whole discussion on neural determinism with an ingenious paradigm. I think that a lot of you already know the paradigm, but nevertheless, since it's so crucial for my talk, I would like to introduce it again. So this is the experimental setup. The idea is very simple. Participants can freely choose when to execute a specific behavior. So usually they have to flex their wrist or press a key. And while they are doing that, they are observing a computer screen on which they see a clock hand rotating. Furthermore, at the same time, their electrical activity of the brain is measured with EEG. Now, for the participants, the experiment look a little bit like that. They sit in front of the computer screen, like you see on the right side. They see this clock hand rotating and are instructed to press a key whenever they want to press the key. It looks like that. So they press a key, and then they are instructed to report the time when they decided to press the key. So we know now when they formed the decision to press the key. And of course, we also know when they actually press the key. And the first thing that Libet found was that the reported intention precedes the movement onset by about 200 milliseconds, 150 to 200 milliseconds. Now, the genius idea of Benjamin Libet was to measure EEG activity and then record an event-related potential backward from the response, which is called the readiness potential. And it is known that the readiness potential precedes intentional behavior. And what he found was very surprising, namely that the onset of the readiness potential preceded the actual response and also the reported intention by a few hundred milliseconds, which seemed to suggest that the brain has already information on the decision before participants become aware of their decision. So Benjamin Libet concluded that the brain decides to initiate, or at least to prepare to initiate, the act before there is any reportable subjective awareness that such a decision has taken place. And this, of course, strongly threatens our intuition of conscious free will, where we think that we decide at the moment when we become aware of our decision what we do. Now, I would like to briefly mention a variation of this paradigm, because the Libet torus is quite different from usual free choice paradigms, because participants only have to choose when to execute an action, but not which action to execute. But there are variants of the paradigm, like this one here, by Soon and colleagues from the John Dillon Haynes group. I was also involved in this publication, where participants can freely choose when to execute an action and also which action to execute. So here, participants sit in front of a computer screen. They see a string of letters on the computer screen. They decide when to act and which action to execute. And then they have to report which letter was on the screen when they decided to act. And in this study, we used functional magnetic resonance imaging and a specific way to analyze fMRI data to predict their behavior from brain activity. And the interesting result was that we could predict the decision, we did that offline, one has to say, about 8 seconds before participants report their decision. However, you have to take into account that the prediction accuracy is 60%, so it's only 10% above chance. Nevertheless, the Libet style experiments and these findings have been used to argue for what I call neural determinism, for the basic idea that there is an unconscious decision that precedes our conscious decision, and then we implement the action. And to put it in a kind of cartoonish-like way, and I know that the philosophers will roll their eyes for that because I humanize the brain, but at the moment I don't care. So you have this unconscious brain that decides a few hundred milliseconds at the moment of the onset of the RP and says, I will do or you will do A, and then only a few hundred milliseconds later, you have the conscious brain that says, oh, yes, I will do A. So this is, in a cartoonish way, the situation. Now, the question is, why do we have this conscious brain at all if the unconscious brain is in control? And Benjamin Libet had a very good explanation for that. He argued that while we can't really consciously decide what we do, we can stop it in the last moment. So if we become aware of our decision, we can still veto it. I won't go into detail with that. Now, this whole idea of neural determinism rests more or less on the basic idea that the readiness potential reflects an unconscious decision to act, that the decision is already taken a few hundred milliseconds before we become aware of it. And this assumption has been challenged. It has been challenged ever since Benjamin Libet published his results, but recently this challenge has become very serious, and I would like to outline briefly two of these challenges: one conceptual challenge and one empirical challenge. And here's the conceptual challenge. Again, I will show a video, this time a vacation video I made a few years ago at the northern France coast when I was still living in Belgium. So here you see waves rolling onto the shore. And you can draw an arbitrary line and then observe the waves that cross the line. So there is some random fluctuation in the waves, some are longer, some are shorter. And we simply observe the waves that cross the line. So if you do that, you get something like that. So the small waves that do not cross the line will average out. But the larger waves that cross this arbitrary line will form something that looks very much like a readiness potential in a way. So in principle, you can produce a kind of readiness potential by putting a threshold onto random fluctuations. And this is exactly the interpretation in a very simplified way that Aaron Sugar put forward. He argued that in Libet-style TART, the readiness potential might result from back-averaging stochastic fluctuations in the motor system. This is, of course, a serious challenge for the interpretation of the Libet TARs, because then the readiness potential would not be really the result of a decision of an unconscious brain, but it would be a kind of averaging artifact in the extreme formulation of this idea. There is also some criticism of this argument, and you need some other components to make this whole thing going, but this is the argument in a nutshell. Another challenge to the idea that the readiness potential is the outcome of an unconscious decision process comes from empirical research. So if it is really true that these brain signals reflect an unconscious decision process, it should in principle be possible to predict decision based on these brain signals. And I would like to remind you that the readiness potential is a back average, a post hoc average of these brainwaves. Recently, people have started to try to predict conscious decisions online from EEG data. And while this has been successful to some degree, it's not extremely successful. So you get a lot of false positives, and the prediction accuracies are not extremely high. But I will come back to that in a minute. So these are only two criticisms of the interpretation of the Libet task. There have been numerous others criticism, but I think for my point, this is already sufficient. Now, the question arises, if the readiness potential is not the outcome of an unconscious decision, what is an alternative, plausible alternative interpretation of these readiness potential and the readiness potential in the Libet task? And here I would like to put forward an idea that in principle argues that decisions in Libet-style experiments are not so fundamentally different from any other decision processes that people make based on perceptual judgments. There are some differences, and I will outline them, but in principle, it is simply a decision situation in a way. And such decision situations have been extensively investigated in the perceptual domain. And because these decision models that evolved from the perceptual domain are crucial to my model of the Libet task, I would like to briefly outline such a perceptual decision-making paradigm. So in perceptual decision-making, participants have to judge, for example, whether this cloud of dots is primarily moving to the right or to the left. This is a simple decision. So participants have perceptual evidence, and based on this evidence, they make their decision. Sometimes the decision is very easy when the coherence of the dot movement is high, and sometimes it's very difficult and could be in principle even impossible when there is no coherent movement in one direction. Now, these models have been conceptualized, or these decision processes have been conceptualized with integration to bound or drift diffusion models. And I would like to briefly explain these models. So in these models, you have two decisions to do A and B. Then you have a starting point, and from this starting point, you accumulate evidence. This is this line here. The evidence accumulation, which is here based on the perceptual information, continues until a threshold is crossed. And if the threshold is crossed, a decision is formed and participants implement this decision. So you have a number of relevant parameters in these integration to bound models that nicely explain reaction time and error rates in this perceptual decision task. So you have a starting point. If your decision is unbiased, the starting point is in the middle between the two boundaries. You have the evidence accumulation process, which can be relatively fast. If you have strong evidence, the accumulation rate is high, or which can be slow if you don't have a lot of evidence, then it's very slow. And you have these boundaries or these thresholds that can be either very far apart or very closely together. And that determines whether you can decide fast or slow as well. Now, if you consider that the Libet type of experiments are in principle decision tasks with minimal information, then you could come up with a model of the Libet task that looks very much like these perceptual decision tasks. So you have an evidence accumulation process, which is reflected in the readiness potential. Then you have a threshold. When the threshold is crossed, a decision is made, and then participants implement the decision. So that would suggest that the readiness potential in principle reflect this build-up of evidence accumulation in a way. Now, obviously, Libet type of experiments are different from perceptual decision tasks So if you want to apply such a model to a Libet task, you have to answer a few questions first. The first question is, what kind of evidence is accumulated in a Libet task? Because there is no perceptual information like in the perceptual decision task. How is the threshold determined? What is the role of the conscious intention in all that? And what would that mean for the predictive value of brain activity preceding conscious intentions? And in the next few minutes, I would like to go through all these questions and explain why I think one can nicely answer them. So first of all, the question is, what kind of evidence is accumulated in Libet experiments? Because participants have to decide not on any external information. They don't have any external input, at least not external input that is controlled by the experimenter. So the only thing they can base their decision on is endogenous information or information from interoceptive signals. So the basic idea would be that in Libet style of experiments, the decision can be based on different type of information. One extreme idea would be that there is no real information and that people simply put a threshold on random fluctuations in the motor system. And this way, if the noise crosses the threshold, they decide and press a key. That would be an extreme formulation. So then there is not really evidence, only noise that is in a way thresholded. But one can also imagine that people, for example, interocept on their internal states and use this interoceptive information to detect a signal that crosses the threshold. One could also imagine that other information determine the decision. So for example, it could be that the response sequence in a choice paradigm where participants have to choose between two different response options, for example, determines what people will do. So if you have responded 3 times with a left response, the likelihood is higher that you do a right response because you think otherwise I wouldn't behave randomly. So these are all potential sources for a drift diffusion model or integration to bound model to work. The second question is, how is the threshold determined in such a model? And here we come to a very interesting aspect of the Libet task that, in my opinion, haven't been discussed a lot in the literature, even though it is, in my opinion, very important, namely the task instruction. In fact, if you do a Libet experiment, or if you ask people who are doing Libet style experiments, participants, of course, get instructions in the beginning of the experiment. They can't freely choose when to press a key. So they can't decide to press a key only every half an hour or every 100 milliseconds. We give them instruction that they should choose within a limited time window. The basic idea is that the threshold is determined by these task instructions and the type of conditional intention that participants form in the beginning of the experiment. So if participants have a lot of time to decide when to press a key, they will put the threshold relatively high, because otherwise they would always decide relatively early. However, if they have less time to decide when to press a key, they will put the threshold relatively low, because then they can reach the threshold faster in a way. And how they put the threshold depends on the experimental instructions. So for example, in the fMRI study that we did, participants should decide within a very long time window. They had 15 seconds or so to decide. While in a classical Libet experiment, it's only a few hundred milliseconds or a few seconds. One could also imagine that participants use a threshold like that, a collapsing threshold. So the threshold is relatively high in the beginning, and then it gets lower and lower. And this way you ensure that the further you are in the trial, the more likely it gets that you will reach the threshold and can reach a decision. Okay, so the basic idea is that the threshold depends on conditional intentions that participants form in the beginning of the experiment based on task instructions. Now, another crucial question is, what is the role of conscious intentions in such a model? Where would you situate conscious intentions in such a decision model of Libet-style experiments? And here, an interesting idea that was put forward a few years ago is that it might, the conscious intention that is reported in the Libet task might correspond to the moment in time when the threshold is crossed, which would be quite consistent with our intuition in a way, that we decide relatively late about our actions. And this idea stems from a study by Kang and colleagues. This is a perceptual decision task in which Kang and colleagues introduce a kind of W judgment in this perceptual decision task that is very similar to the one I showed you in the beginning, this random dot motion task. And they tested whether if they use the W judgment, so the time of conscious intention as the moment in time when the threshold is crossed, whether this is consistent with their data and fits the model well. And this is exactly what they found. So if they took the time of conscious intention at the moment in time when the threshold is crossed, this nicely fits the data and can be used by the model to explain the data. So this is at least some evidence for the idea that maybe the time of conscious intention is the moment in time when the threshold is crossed. And this is at the end of the day, the point in time when the decision is finally made. Now, the last question, what does it tell us about the predictive value of brain activity preceding conscious intention? So in the Libet type of interpretation of the Libet experiments, a decision is made relatively early, and then we become only aware of the decision a few hundred milliseconds later. So in principle, in such a model, it should be possible to predict the conscious decision relatively early in the trial. In this kind of decision model that I put forward here, in principle, all the response options are on the table until more or less the last moment when the threshold is crossed, and only then the decision is taken. So depending on whether the decision is strongly biased, it might be much more difficult to predict the conscious intention from brain signal, because early in the trial it isn't already determined which decision you are going to take. And here's an illustration of this basic idea. So if you have this integration to bound model, you can have something like that. The evidence accumulation process, or kind of noise, approaches the threshold, but doesn't reach the threshold and falls down again. And in this case, participants wouldn't respond because the threshold isn't reached, while the signal looks very much like a readiness potential. And if you would try to predict the conscious decision from this signal, you would fail, because you would predict that people would decide, but they wouldn't. And interestingly, there is a recent study by the John Dillon Haynes group, by Schulze Kraft, who try to online predict conscious intentions in a kind of game-like setup where the brain-computer interface try to compete with participants. So they try to predict conscious intentions early on. And they were successful to some degree, but they also had a very high false alarm rate. So very often, something happened that is very similar to what I described here. They predicted that the person will decide, but they didn't. And furthermore, they could show that the participants were able to revise their choice until relatively late in the trial. So until 200 milliseconds before they implemented their decision, participants were able to revise their choice. So it doesn't really look as if there is a very early decision that you only become aware of relatively late. But there is another type of evidence, I think even stronger evidence for the idea that the decision process, that the decision is only reached relatively late in the whole intentional decision situation. And in order to explain this idea, I have to explain a little bit subliminal priming. This is an experiment that was carried out by Ariel Furstenberg, who investigated whether unconscious response tendencies that are introduced by subliminal primes can be overwritten by in an intentional choice situation. So the basic paradigm was as follows: participant get a fixation cross, then they see a prime. This is a directional cue, which points either to the right, to the left, or is neutral, points in both directions. And this prime is then masked by a mask. And it has been demonstrated since the 90s that these masks make the prime subliminal. So participants afterwards can't really report what they saw. They don't even have most of the time an idea that they saw anything rather than the mask. So in principle, participants are not aware of these primes. They have no conscious representation of the primes. However, it has been demonstrated that these primes influence behavior. So if people see a right prime, they tend to select the right response. And if they see a left prime, they tend to select the left response. And then participants get a target. And this they see. So this is completely aware. And in classical experiments, this target either pointed to the right, which could be congruent or incongruent to the prime, or to the left. In the experiment by Ariel Furstenberg, and this is the interesting manipulation he introduced, there was also a free choice target where participants could freely choose which response to execute. And I will report responses on these free choice trials. So participants get a prime, they are not aware of this prime, then they get this target and have to freely choose between the two response alternatives. So for participants, the experiment looked a little bit like this. Here you could see the prime in the mask. In the experiments, you couldn't. So they see this mask stimulus, and then they freely choose which action to execute. Now, what Ariel Furstenberg did, in addition to measuring responses, he also measured something that is called the lateralized readiness potential. And I also briefly have to introduce this because it's very crucial to the basic idea of the experiment. The lateralized readiness potential precedes a response, a voluntary response, by 200 milliseconds or something like that. So, and it reflects in principle activation in the motor cortex. So if you press a left key, you will find a readiness potential on the right side and immediately before the response. And if you press a left key, you will find it on the left side. So you can compare brain activity of the left and right side, and then you can compute how strong the readiness potential is for the hand with which you respond. Here, if you respond with the right, this would be the right response here. So this is a lateralized readiness potential. And here you can see that the readiness potential goes in the direction of the hand with which you respond. Now, the interesting question is what happens in the situation that Ariel Furstenberg tested. In congruent trials, it's relatively easy. So you get a subliminal prime, then you get a target, and you can choose which response you want to execute. Let's assume the prime is a left response, and you decide to press a left key. Then the lateralized readiness potential will simply go in the direction of the chosen response. Very simple. The interesting situation occurs for the incongruent situation. So let's assume you get a subliminal prime that primes a left response, but then you choose to respond with the right hand. So the prime should prime you in the left direction while you actually choose to go for the right response. So the crucial question is, what happens in these situations? Is there really a kind of buildup of the lateralized readiness potential in the wrong direction that is then overwritten, and that even in a situation where participants are absolutely not aware of this response tendencies because it would be induced by a subliminal prime? And I will show you the data in a minute. First of all, these are the behavioral responses. So participants can freely choose, and in most of the trials, they go with a subliminal prime. So in 57% of the trials, they choose the response that was primed, even though they were not aware of the prime. And this simply replicates previous findings in a way. However, in 42%, they go against the prime. So the prime would, for example, prime the right response, but they would carry out a left response. So they seem to override this subliminal response tendency in a way. Now, the crucial question is what happens in the readiness potential? Is it the case that you, in the incongruent trials, first find a buildup for the readiness potential in the wrong direction that is then overwritten, or do they simply not perceive really the prime in the cases where they go against it, or maybe it doesn't really affect their motor preparation? And here are the results. So these are the incongruent trials, the red trials. The blue trials, the blue line are the congruent trials, and the black line are the congruent trials, and this blue line is the neutral trials, where no direction is primed subliminally. So this is the response hand. So this is the response that they finally show, that is notated downwards. Now, first, the congruent trials are very simple. The readiness potential goes in the direction of the response, and then they respond. What happens afterwards is not so crucial. You have a kind of rebound effect, but that's not so crucial. The crucial question is what happens in incongruent trials. The question is, does it prime first lead the lateralized readiness potential, so to say, in the wrong direction before participants revise this decision and then choose the response that they choose? And this is exactly what is happening. So here you can see the lateralized readiness potential first going in the direction of the non-chosen response, and then it changes direction and goes in the direction of the chosen response. And then participants choose this response. So it looks as if you have this kind of tendency that is reflected in the lateralized readiness potential that goes first in the wrong direction and then is overwritten and goes in the direction of the chosen response. And this is, of course, extremely interesting because participants are not aware that this here happens, because they are not aware of these unconscious primes that trigger this response tendency in a way. So it looks a little bit as if participants override this unconscious response tendency in the wrong direction. And this is also how Ariel Furstenberg interpreted these results. But if this is really true, and this would be completely consistent with an integration to bound model of intentional choice, because you could argue until this threshold isn't reached, everything is possible. So you can, in principle, reverse for some reason because you think you should respond with the other hand in this trial. You can reverse the process even unconsciously. Okay. This is in principle a summary of the model we put forward for intentional choice. We called the model the coin-top model, conditional intentions and integration to bound model of intentional action. And there are a few crucial points here. So the basic idea is that in Libet style of experiments, they do not, in principle, differ from other decision experiments. The only difference is that here participants have to base their decision on internal information, not on perceptual information. And it is an interesting discussion what these internal information are. It is also crucial to notice that the parameters of this model are in principle configured by conditional intentions that participants form in the beginning of the experiment based on task instructions. So it's very crucial that participants form these intentions, because only if they form these intentions, they are able to carry out the task in the way the experimenter wants them to do. And finally, the crucial point is that the decision is only taken when the threshold is crossed. And in principle, it can also happen that the threshold isn't crossed and the decision is only made later in a way. Okay, to put it in a cartoonish way again, so the Libet idea was that you have this unconscious brain that decides what you are going to do, and you are only informed retrospectively about it, and you only learn about that in order to veto the action. Our model would assume that the unconscious brain isn't as clever as Libet assumes. It's not very decided. A few hundred milliseconds before the decision, it might say, oh, maybe I should do A. Then it becomes more confident. But the decision is only made relatively late in the trial, about 200 milliseconds before the response. Only then, and this is the moment in time when participants become aware of their intention, only then the decision is really made. Okay. So what are the implications of these findings? First of all, brain activation preceding conscious intention reflects a decision process rather than a decision. So it's not that the decision is taken early. There is a decision process built up of evidence accumulation, but the decision is only taken relatively late. This is my second point. The decision process is configured by conditional intention, with participants form in the beginning of the experiment. And this is very crucial, because if you are interested to understand how decisions are made in Libet style experiment, you have to look at the experimental instructions, which hasn't been done a lot in a way. And you can vary the experimental instructions, how much time participants have to decide to execute an action, and these kind of parameters, and this should strongly influence the decision process. Also, a very important implication, if it is really the case that Libet style experiments follow very similar rules than classical perceptual decision tasks, there is not such a principal difference between perceptual decisions and these intentional decisions. In principle, they only differ in the type of evidence that is accumulated. Perceptual or external evidence in perceptual decision tasks, and internal evidence in Libet style tasks. And this is also my last point, that this in a way also rehabilitates the Libet type of experiments, because participants have always criticized that's a very artificial situation, which it certainly is. But one could argue that in principle, the mechanisms that take place in Libet style experiments are not so fundamentally different from other type of decision situations like perceptual decision situations. And with this, I would like to finish my presentation, and I would like to thank you for your attention. I have now talked 50 minutes or 55 minutes. I only wanted to talk 45 minutes. And I would also like to thank the researchers that did this research with me, Ariel Fürstenberg and Alfred Mealy, with whom we wrote this paper developed the coin-top model. And Oliver Genschow, who is a psychologist who was in Ghent for a while as postdoc, he is now in Cologne. He's doing very original experiments, and with him, we did the Hand of God experiments. So thanks again for your attention, and sorry for taking almost an hour for my talk. Okay, I will stop the screen sharing so that I can see all of you.
Okay, thank you very much, Marcel. It was very clear, very interesting. I have 1,000 questions. I can only make one as agreed. So I will, if we have time in the end, I will ask you about some other research you have recently participated in, the free will manipulation and meta-analysis, and what you think of that. But that is for another time, if we have the time at the end. What I want to ask you right now is about the end of your presentation, your implications, especially implication number 2. If I don't know if you can come back to that.
I don't know whether I will briefly.
Yes, if you can share so that everyone can.
Is it no? Do I share the screen now or no? So,
yeah, maybe.
Huh?
Let me just talk about what that is.
The decision is only taken when the decision threshold is which is at the moment of conscious intention. That was the second point.
Fantastic. That is it. The decision is only taken then. My question to you, and please tell me if it's not it's not clear. But the thing is, saying that the decision is taken at that moment posits another element that is not necessary. I mean, the decision is not made when the threshold is crossed. It is the crossing itself. Couldn't we interpret it like that? But that is still a mechanistic process, you know. It's still. Do you understand my problem here?
Absolutely. I mean, and I think it's a very relevant question, in particular in the context of the Libet experiment, because of course the participants have to report their conscious intention is quite artificial in a way. And people normally, if they would carry out such a task, if you would tell participant press a key whenever you would want to press a key, participants would press a key. They wouldn't really have an experience of conscious intention in these situations. And of course, a lot of intentional actions do not come with this experience of conscious decisions in a way. So in this sense, I absolutely agree. The Libet task is in a way an artificial situation where you force participants to form this intention and report on this intention. Now, as I said, you have a lot of decisions that do not come with this phenomenal experience, but of course you also have decisions that come with this experience. In particular, if the decisions are important, you have decisions where participants consciously experience this decision. But I absolutely agree. In the Libet task is a kind of surplus that is not really necessary. But what we try to do, of course, here is not to explain all kinds of decision situations. We simply wanted to explain the Libet experiment and the findings from the Libet experiment, because these findings have been taken as arguments for this neural determinism argument. And we simply wanted to argue, this is not extremely plausible. There is a more plausible explanation. And this is what we wanted to do, but I agree, in principle, one has to look at other decisions that do not come with this experience or where the experience is really natural and not forced by the experimenter, if you really want to understand conscious decision-making. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, so we have questions here in the Q&A. I don't know if any of the panelists have questions. We can go directly to the Q&A. Okay, Professor Thomas Naderhofer and Professor Sinara raised their hands. So Thomas, thank you very much for your question. The floor is yours.
Sure. Marcel, it's nice to meet you. You just got done with a chapter for my volume, so it's nice to actually, I don't think I've ever actually seen your face, so that's great.
Okay, great, nice
so,
to meet you. I think we have met, sorry.
Yeah, so this was a way of maybe asking a question that tied some of the stuff you said in the middle, and the hand and Maradona stuff I think is great. And then I wanted to ask a question about how that ties back to some of the fault psychology stuff you mentioned at the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
And if I remember the hand of God stuff, it wasn't just that they attributed more intentionality the higher they scored on the free will inventory. I remember somehow that they were more likely to make mistakes when it comes to whether things were objectively unintentional. And so then, which is, I think that's how it went. I'm not positive about that, but so that's stage one question. Is like, was that right?
I have to admit, I don't remember exactly, but it's absolutely positive. It's absolutely possible that they are less confident and make more errors. Yeah, I find it plausible, but I'm not sure whether we report it in the paper.
Yeah, so I guess that was at least my interpretation at the time, because of they were more likely to make mistakes in the case where it was objectively, in some sense, not intentional. Mm-hmm. And then I wondered how this tied to some of the stuff by like Corey Clark and others, where what comes first is responsibility attribution. And so from an evolutionary sense, I do way better if I attribute intentionality to people who do bad things around me, because if I mess that up and make mistakes, I pay a serious penalty. I don't care so much about whether they do good things, because that could be good or bad, I don't know, but I benefit either way, so I'm not very worried about it. Mm-hmm. And so we're very cued to harmful behavior. And as a result, we may have developed, that's Clark's view, right? We developed in some sense free will as a post hoc justification of these desires to be extra mindful of people's bad behavior. And I wondered if you think that there's a way in which the stuff that you seem to be doing might shed light on that issue, which is not really what you're looking at. You're just looking at the brain. But what I wanted, so that was the first part. But the related piece is, I have this feeling that if you didn't know any of this neuroscience, mm-hmm. and I watched your talk, even though what you were saying is, oh look, consciousness is doing more work than we thought. If I don't know any of this, I'm still thinking, oh my God, this is all the brain. Like I'm not this, like, and so like even my consciousness is a brain state. So it's not determinism, maybe. I'll talk about that on Friday. But it's like, even if you try to explain to people, oh no, the Libet stuff is misleading, they might still walk away with this feeling that, man, that was awful. That's catastrophic. Back to Smolansky's thing. Anyway, it's a way of thinking that there's the mechanistic dualistic piece, and then there's the rest of it. The talk was great. It was
okay. So first of all, to your first point, I mean, there is this tendency to attribute intentionality to patterns in the world, this kind of intentionality bias. And this is an interesting question. I think there are a number of very interesting aspects to your question. One is whether, and I don't know whether you implied that, whether you observe positive or negative behavior, whether this should matter. And that would be interesting to investigate. I mean, we have also investigated this intention attribution in the fundamental attribution error. And there you could also look at positive or negative consequences. I'm not sure whether I have a strong idea about that, whether I would argue that people would presumably attribute more intentionality to negative behavior than to positive behavior. I'm not sure about that, whether there is this asymmetry in a way.
Well, let me just ask a quick follow-up, because so Marcelo yesterday was talking about one of the questions, actually I don't remember if it was Gilberto or Marcelo's talk, but one of the questions was about why is all this about blame and not praise? And there's this long-standing puzzle in the literature where like it's so blame focused, and like ironically that too may just reflect the fact that we care more about it, you know.
Yeah,
even the philosophical interest in it is skewed.
Yeah, so and I think this is in a way a little bit ideological. if you want. So there is this idea, and I think it comes presumably from philosophy, yeah, that if free will is disproven, our whole society will break down. I mean, you have this more positive perspective of Derek Parable, which also focuses on negative consequences, by the way, but at least he gives it a kind of positive spin. But to come back to your question, so the positive negative thing, I'm not 100% sure about it. With respect to this general attribution of intentionality, whether we have this general bias to attribute intentionality to behavior, this has been shown in some situation. Interestingly, we recently also have a line of research where we wanted to study that more specifically. So we looked at biological motion processing in random noise and wanted to see whether participants who are high on free will beliefs identify these, in principle, biological motion either better than people who are not high on free will beliefs. And interestingly, we didn't find a relationship with free will beliefs, but with dualism there. And this was quite consistent. So what we then finally thought is that these dualistic beliefs are related to paranormal beliefs. So what these people do, they tend to see pattern in the world in a way, people high in dualism. And therefore, they do not only see pattern of biological motion and intentional action, they even see pattern in this random dot motion. They show more sensitivity to this dot motion pattern. So this seemed to be related to dualism rather than free will. I don't know whether this answers your question. I'm not 100% sure. So you are muted, sorry, but you can't.
Oh no, sorry. I just said that was great. It wasn't so much. It was more just wanting to hear you speak to whether there might be something in there that
but I think anyway, this is a very interesting aspect, and I think there should go more research into that. The problem is only that, and this is, I think, the point that Renato wanted to raise, that the experimental evidence that we have seem to be very weak. So in principle, you would want to investigate that experimentally, and there is not much. I mean, we have used experiments and found results and didn't, but at least the experimental manipulations are very weak. And then you are dealing with correlations, and you know that correlations are always tricky because maybe people who believe in free will have other differ in many other respects from people who don't. So, and therefore addressing these questions is a little bit tricky with these correlational approaches.
Just an interesting piece of trivia, I guess. Corey Clark calls this principle the Don Corleone principle. Like, okay, something bad happens to my son, I'm gonna see that it's intentional. It's not an accident. So I will call everything intentional.
Yeah, I mean, in psychology, you have a whole theory, the attribution theory, that deals with these kind of attribution, that you attribute a failure of yourself to external causes and success to yourself if you are not depressed. And then you have this fundamental attribution error. So there are a lot of phenomena in social psychology, and it would be very interesting to look how these are related to free will and free will beliefs. And Oliver Genschow, who is a social psychologist, is currently busy doing this type of research. So I think we will see more of that in the future.
Okay, let's go to some of the questions in the Q&A so we can have a participation from the participants. So I'll ask this question from Xiaolong Wang. Please correct me if I'm not saying it right. Given the Libet style experiments design, the participants are told to keep still until they decide to act. But what if we let them keep acting until they decide to stop and keep still or decide to change their acts? Would you expect that different design may lead to different discoveries? It seems it might affect the patterns of readiness potential. Thanks for your time.
I mean, this is a very interesting question, because we have, and others have done these types of experiments in a completely different context, namely in this veto context. So we did some experiments on this idea that people can veto their actions after they become aware of these actions. These are experiments that I did together with Patrick Hackett, where participants had to decide to execute an action, but then cancel this decision in the last moment, which is the kind of esoteric experimental setup. And in order to come up with a more plausible experimental setup, we designed experiments where participants are continuously moving and they have to decide stop moving in a way. And the interesting thing, I think, I don't know whether we ever published this, but I think others did. What you find is also a readiness potential for the stopping in a way. So the stopping is also preceded by a readiness-like potential. And I have done some research with Simone Kühn years ago, also on intentional non-action, where you decide not to act. And even then we found evidence that there is this kind of, that there are these brain signals preceding even an intention not to act. So what I would assume is that it doesn't really matter whether that these signals reflect a decision process. And it doesn't matter whether you act or you don't act. In a way, you find very similar brain signals in both situations, because at least these early readiness potential reflect this decision build-up.
Thank you, Marcel. Marcel, your camera is shaking a lot, so.
Yeah, that is because I'm shaking my
okay.
knees. I will stop doing that.
Okay, Sinara, please.
Here. Thank you very much, Marcel, for your, very great talk.
Thanks.
I have just a question of clarification, because I'm with you, yeah, and with all those who think that actually the decision is made, yeah, and when you reach the threshold in the second moment, yeah, and when you have 200 milliseconds, and then the RP before is going to reflect not the decision in itself, but the process of decision, yeah. But my question is, and here is the clarification. I'm not sure that I quite understood the stuff of the congruent and incongruent. Because if it's true, and I think that's true, that what's happening before is the decision process, then would be expected, I mean, the graph that people go in one direction, and then they change and go for the other direction, and that happens with the incongruent. Because actually what they are doing there is just weighting pros and cons, yeah? Then what I think that what would puzzle me would be the congruent, that people actually don't show this inversion in the curve. Unless I didn't understand very well this question about the congruent and the incongruent stuff. I think that would puzzle me wouldn't be the incongruent, but the congruent, because it looks like they are not they are not waiting. They have already a decision. I don't know what you think about this. Maybe I'm not understanding correctly the discussion.
I think this is a very interesting point. So the point you are making is why in the congruent case you don't have this. Sometimes they go in one direction and sometimes in the other.
Exactly, because this is the way that you decide. You think, well, pros for this and cons, and then then you go in the direction.
Ariel Fürstenbeck has investigated this with a very clever design in principle. So what he did was he took the free choice trials where they decided, I don't know whether he only looked at congruent trials, I think so. So he only looked at congruent trials. And then he differentiated trials where participants made a decision relatively fast with trials where they made a decision relatively slow. And what he found was that in the slow trials, you indeed have a buildup in the wrong direction and then it goes in the right direction, exactly as you are arguing. But in the fast trials, it goes directly in the right direction, so to say. I'm not sure whether people are really weighing up different options there. I think presumably there are biases in the system that drive the decision in a way. And very often, maybe people have a kind of weak preconception what they want to do, and that drives the system in a way. But there might be situations, and this is really demonstrated by Ariel Furstenberg, who I think this is a very important study that hasn't been cited a lot, unfortunately. In his study, he shows that at least when participants take a long time to make the decision, sometimes the decision process seems to go in the wrong direction, exactly as you are arguing. So very good point.
Professor Gabriel?
Hi, Marcel. Thanks a lot. Very illuminating talk, very thought-provoking. Just before, I have to comment the Shyalong one appears. We have friends from all over the world. That's so cool. People from China, people from India. That's quite impressive. I'm sorry about the people in Asia if the schedule is kind of uncomfortable for you, but even for the people in Europe, sometimes it's difficult to follow our night talks. But let's go to my questions. First of all, Marcel, it seems to be kind of a consensus, the accumulator model between us here at the event. If the accumulator model is so promising, don't you think we are supposed to start testing conditions to see how the accumulator model responds to different populations? For example, I am a night owl. I'm a very nocturnal guy. I'm sure that my accumulator model is faster by the night than by the morning, for example. I would like to be tested, for example, in this situation, by the morning when I'm slow, and like by the night when I'm flying, my brain's flying, for example. I think people have different circadian rhythms. That would be a good thing to be tested. We all believe so much at the accumulator model. We could have different populations as well, like neurotypical and anxiety patients, for example. I'll bet the anxiety patients will react kind of faster as well. I bet also if you want to augment this difference, if you got expert meditators versus anxiety people, you're going to see a huge difference. I start with this one. I'll let people ask more, but I think that's already thought-provoking.
Yeah, I think you have a very good point here. I think one should try to test the predictions that come out of the model. And this is also why we try to specify the model a little bit. For example, with this idea of conditional intention, that the instructions in the beginning, in principle, specify the parameters of this decision model. And I think the first step that one has to take is to test this prediction. What happens if you vary the response window, for example? What happens if you introduce a bias in the decision, like Ariel Furstenberg did, and these kind of ideas? And then, of course, one could also look at pathologies. So I'm absolutely with you that one has to test these ideas. Regarding the consens about this model, maybe here it is because you have a selective bunch of speakers that promote the same idea. I'm not so sure whether in particular in the philosophy community, but also in the neuroscience community, it is so consensual in a way. I'm not so sure about that. Recently, I heard a Berlin neurologist on radio who was reporting on Libet's that type of experience as it has been reported in the 80s. So no kind of change. I think there is a kind of bias here because Adino, of course, propagates that in a way. But I'm absolutely with you. I think it's crucial to test specific predictions. And then the question is also this evidence accumulation process. Of course, Adina and Aaron Scherger, they argue that this noise process plays a crucial role. I think presumably there are other processes that are crucial. I think, for example, that this interoceptive information are extremely crucial, that people might monitor their interoceptive state and then they form kind of conditional intentions. If I experience something, I will press the key. So in this respect, your meditation population would be very interesting. So I think we also have to if we want to really propagate this model, we have to look deeper into the processes that drive this in a way. So I think a very good point.
Thanks.
Can I just be a little provocative here? So Marcel, if this this idea now proposed by Aaron and Adina now, and that the evidence accumulated is just noise, is just random fluctuation, as opposed to your model and Mel's, that's the coin toss model. Could we call that the coin toss model? It's like
I see Adina appearing on the screen, so maybe she wants to say something about it. Because also, of course, the model by Adina and Aaron doesn't claim that it's only noise accumulation, but maybe she should respond to that.
Yeah, I think, should I say something now?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm very sympathetic to, you know, a much broader view of what the signals are. What we are really arguing against is this early decision view, and the accumulator model, I think, is open as to whether the signals being integrated are just noise or other kinds of interoceptive signals or signals from volitional processes that are, you know, instead of just, you know, being fictional signals, they're real signals, but they don't look RP-like in the individual cases. So, so we briefly mentioned in the paper that came out, you know, this bumps model or the motor ideation model. And of course, there are other kinds of signals like memory of the choices one has made previously if you're trying to choose between two things. So, I mean, that's, I think, one of the explanations for why in John Dillon's fMRI studies, they get some predictive power. I think that they're looking at among other things like memory traces for previous decisions. So I think that our commitment is to the accumulator model and late decision, but not to noise being the only causal factor driving the system. But the point is that in these spontaneous cases where there's no evidence to, you know, no external evidence driving the signal for decision, you have to rely on some other kind of signal, whether it's internal evidence from interoceptive sources or other volitional kinds of signals, which you might also think are interoceptive of a sort, or just noise if there's nothing else to go on.
I mean, for me, the interesting aspect is that with this type of research, the paradigm is back in the psychological realm, so to say. So we are looking simply at decision processes that are based on different information. And now we can use our whole repertoire of experimental psychology to investigate what type of signals are driving these decision processes. I mean, I'm a little bit afraid that philosophers will become quite disappointed by that, because it completely demystifies the experimental paradigm and makes it unusable for the original purpose in a way. Yeah, I don't know.
I don't really agree with that. So I think that the philosophical interpretation might vary depending on what kind of meaning you put on the signal that's driving it. So, you know, if the signal that's driving it is purely noise, certain philosophers might find that sort of not very comforting for free will. But if those signals instead are some kind of volitional signal coming from another part of the body or the brain, that might be interpreted differently. So, the question of, is it me that's making the decision or not, can be answered differently depending on the nature of the signal that's being accumulated. And so I think that the interplay between philosophical positions and the empirical evidence is not straightforward and could be very interesting depending on what we find out is driving the signal, or driving the accumulator.
Okay, great to hear.
Thanks for your talk. It was great.
We have to hear from Walter now.
So I have a really simple question, like philosophers ask, short but difficult. What do you mean by decision? Libet says that the RP is the decision, the brain making a decision. Well, what if you just gave up that word and said, look, we know what's going on in the brain. I don't care whether you call it a decision or not. I mean, people argue about, is it early decision? Is it late decision? Is this stochastic model talking about a decision process, or whether there's a voluntary impulse from some other part of the brain? I understand the decision process in the sense that it occurs over time. But if you ask, at what particular time does the decision occur, I lose track of what you mean by decision.
I mean, I think there are 2 points to that. And interestingly, in a different talk, John Dylan Haynes raised a very similar issue. I think what we try to argue and others try to argue, that at least this simple interpretation of Libet-style experiment, that something has already happened a few hundred milliseconds before, and then you are only informed about it retrospectively, and that this is a kind of ballistic process that can be reversed. And I think there were a lot of people that believe that, even though retrospectively they might not admit that. This isn't very plausible. So you have a decision process, as you said, that is building up, and then you have different points in time where so to say, the system changes a kind of state. So there is certainly a point in time when you shoot out the motor response where you can't stop your decision in a way. That's without any question. So you can investigate with stop signal TARS. So about 150 milliseconds before a response, you can't take that back. So there are state transitions in the brain that are not reversible, or at least difficult to reverse.
So is that what makes it a decision, that it's only a decision when it's impossible to reverse it? Because I decided what I'm going to have for dinner tonight, but I can change my mind.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, then presumably you made a decision and then you revise your decision in a way.
Yeah, but I'm saying that irreversibility is not necessary for a decision.
No, but I simply said that there are points where the decision is irreversible and where you can say there is a clear state change in a way. And I mean, this decision point that we are arguing for is in principle a kind of theoretical point. You can look at brain processes and see whether, for example, at this point in time, the motor cortex for the decided response is pre-activated. And then you might still be able, and that we try to argue, you have a very brief time window between this theoretical decision point, 200 milliseconds before the action, and the point of no return, where you can't take back your motor command, where you might be able to revise your decision in a way. So depending on the type of decision, there are points where specific things are more or less determined. And this is simply what we are arguing for.
So let me ask one more follow-up and then I'll hand it over to Gabriel. So could you describe all of your scientific work without using the word decision at all?
I mean, presumably I could do that.
Good.
Whether I would want to do that is another problem, another question.
I'm suggesting you might consider it, because I think that word creates a lot of confusion.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah. I mean, these are concepts that are used in psychology to describe specific states, and I understand that philosophers have problems with some of these terms, but
psychologists don't try to time the decision down to 10 milliseconds. I mean, I understand decision process over time. That's what psychologists usually study. When you start asking, is it 500 milliseconds before, or is it 200 milliseconds before?
But honestly, this is not true. I mean, these integration to bound models are excessively used in psychology, in perceptual decision making. To explain, in principle, these are models. You try to explain data with them. You try to explain a specific data distribution and error distribution with these kind of models. And of course, they are models. And in this sense, you can dispute how you call specific parameters like this threshold crossing in these models. But it's excessively used by psychologists to explain data.
I take it back. Psychologists do it too. A plague on both of you. You should, I don't understand what's gained by calling it decision instead of describing the neural processes that are going on and thinking of decision as the overall process without any particular temporal.
Yeah, you could do that. But if you design models like this integration to bound models that assume that a threshold is crossed, however you would want to call that, you can call that a threshold crossing in a way, and not a decision if you want. So I don't know whether you gain so much from that. If you do that, you can explain with this theoretical construct, however you would want to call it, you can explain the data better than without it. And this is what we try to do.
Good, thanks.
You're welcome.
So yeah, after Walter's question, I'll go in two very different directions, a more philosophical side and more neuroscientific, technically oriented side. In the more philosophically oriented side, I mean, I kind of disagree with you that the general mechanism of decision making is this one. I mean, I really tend to believe that ecological relevance makes a difference. I tend to understand that those paradigms are very idealized, and they really focus on a very important sort of decision making. This one that is done within very constrained temporal boundaries. The example that Walter brings to us about, changing plans for what we are having for dinner is still mild. I mean, we can think about, long-term pre-planning. We can, I was studying IQ in chess, for example, in chess playing. You see people there, they can compute 300, plays in advance, and they change it all the time. They updating all the time, You have, in China, they have pre-planned economy for the next 50 years. So, there's something about pre-planning that I don't know if this kind of model will fall within the scope and limitations of this model. And also very ecologically relevant decision making, as for example, moral decision making, when you have a more semantic loaded areas of a brain playing a role. So I go for this first question and then I go to the second. Please, I want to hear you.
Okay, great that you are asking the questions in a sequence rather than directly after each other. I always have problems with philosophers that pose 3 questions and I have forgotten the first part. So let's see whether, correct. I wouldn't claim that this model explains all kind of decisions. And this is also, of course, not the intention of such a model. I mean, we are looking at a very, very restricted kind of experimental situation that had a lot of implications for thinking about thinking of philosophers and neuroscientists. And the only thing that we try to do here is to say the interpretation is not very valid in a way. We don't want to say that such a model can explain all kinds of decision situations. And of course, there is a rich psychology on decision-making in more complex situations in social psychology, also in cognitive psychology. And yeah, this follows completely different rules, has completely different questions. I absolutely wouldn't doubt that. So yeah, I'm absolutely with you on that. You are muted, sorry.
My next question is much more technically oriented. I don't know if you get deep into the interface between, and I already cited like normal population in different moments of their circadian rhythms. I proposed the meditators, the anxiety patients, but I think we have a very important population when we talk about readiness potential, namely athletes. You just cited Maradona. I bet that Maradona's readiness potential is always there. I mean, the guy is, even if he had a belly, he was fast. And so, I mean, I was reading a lot of experiments about readiness potential with athletes recently. I was a physical education graduate program researcher for 3 years and something. So, for example, this article of Vogt, Kato, Scheida, Turk, and Canosi, I mean, they show that novice athletes, I already pressed Adina with that, but novice athletes have much earlier ERPs than very expert athletes. You know, it seems that the ERP formation temporarily shows some effort, and for those that are really skilled, the onset of the ERP is later, but much higher, much bigger, much larger. This is one article. The other article is about comparing archers, like archery, I mean, and the expert archers have the same results. The expert archers have later ERP onsets, but larger onsets as well. I mean, I'm not talking about the lateralized ERP. I'm talking about the central ERP. And still, I mean, people there have their reflexes trained. They have very late onset of ERP, but very large. It seems that people they are not that physically skilled. They make more effort. I mean, taking stock of all this evidence, where I think the ERP is just a preparation for motor action to press the button in the lab. And if you are really working with decisions, as simple as the one that Walter cited, the one with having that or this for dinner, or if it's like buying a car or a house, I think it's a little bit more complex. But even though for all the ethically and morally important decisions, there is no harm if you don't have a muscular contraction at the end. So the ERP is still very important to this more morally oriented questions as well. So I'll love to hear about all. I mean, you're commenting all of I said, but also for this specific thing of this little temporal window that you can somehow, as you said, using your vocabulary, override the decision. Because these, I mean, until the end of his career, Libet was stressing the possibility of the veto.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the veto idea is a very interesting one. And I mean, we more or less stumbled accidentally into that with an fMRI study. That one then got a lot of attention, yeah. So I mean, I think the veto is a little bit a tricky thing in the Libet sense, because the way Libet conceptualizes it doesn't really make sense. Because if you would only try to veto a decision at the moment when you become aware of the decision, then your possibility of veto would be extremely restricted. It would be only a few tens milliseconds that you could make this decision, which is very difficult. How people, sorry, I'm using again the word decision, but how people should make a decision on such a brief period of time. So what I think is happening is that, again, people configure a kind of decision model that they then only implement. And our idea about that in the context of these integration to bound models, I left that out because it's a little bit complicated, and I thought the talk is already complicated enough, is that you have post-decisional evidence accumulation. And one possibility is that participants in the beginning define a second threshold. So if this evidence falls below this threshold within a specific time window, then they use that to trigger the inhibition of the action in a way. Then again, it wouldn't be an instantaneous decision not to do it when you become aware of it, but you would configure a process that then when it is fulfilled, namely when the decision threshold is crossed again or something like that, because you are not confident about your decision, that this triggers then this veto or the stopping reaction. That is the only way I could conceptualize it, because at least in these type of tasks, otherwise you wouldn't have time to really stop the action. But I think what is happening is that in this experiment where you allow participants to stop the decision in the last moment, they would do it like that, or even more dramatically. And that is what we had in some of our experiments. Participants simply pre-decide. They simply decide beforehand that they don't do it. And it's very difficult to get them to decide only in the last moment, because, yeah, why should they do it? They can say, okay, in this trial, I simply don't press a key. So it's very difficult to get them to decide in the last moment not to do something. But if this is possible at all, then only with a kind of configuration of the decision process as I outlined, kind of post-decisional evidence accumulation. Sorry, you are muted again.
And what about the first part of my questions? The fact that very skillful athletes have later on sets of ERP, but much larger than novices.
I mean, yeah, it's an interesting observation. So one could imagine that they, because of their skill, they have to initiate the whole decision process much later, because it doesn't take them so much time to reach a threshold in a way. So that would be the simple interpretation. So if I'm extremely skillful, presumably it takes me much less effort and presumably time to come up with such decisions in a way. That would be my idea about it.
Thanks a lot, Marcel. I don't know if there's still Q&As from the audience, Renato. Luciana.
There's no, if you can read it, because somehow it has disappeared to me. If you can read it, it's not on my Q&A. You're muted, Gabriel.
Yeah, okay. I'm trying to find Luciana's question. Okay, quiz.
So you mean
she says in Libet's experiment, since there is a clock, an oscilloscope in front of the participant, could it function as a target? So that once decide previously that he'll move when the timer or the clock shows a determinate chosen time. She was asking, I mean, about pre-plannings, and the participant already have fixed whenever it's 45, I'll move. And she that will somehow contamine the results?
I mean, that is completely possible. And in these experiments, you try to do everything to prevent that by starting the clock at different positions, in a way, not always at 12 o'clock. And by instructing participants not to use these kind of strategies in a way. But of course, it is in principle possible that people take the clock as a kind of trigger in a way. And you can only prevent that by instructing participants not to do that. Like you have to do in a lot of these experiments. I mean, for example, these veto experiments that we did, I mean, we had to exclude a lot of participants that simply told us, this is stupid, I can't do that. I can't form an intention to press a key and then don't press it. Why should I form an intention in the first place? So you need some type of collaboration from the participant side. And the question is always whether participants really show this kind of commitment in a way. And that's why some people, I think Patrick always said, the best participants are musicians also, people that are very used to this kind of introspective kind of mind state. So they don't mind. Well, a lot of other people simply say this whole idea, I mean, this whole task is completely stupid.
Yeah, and I mean, I have a guess here. For example, I don't know. I obviously biased because I mean I was trained by Georg Nordhoff, your national German psychiatry, neurosciences, and philosopher. And I mean, we will explain this about the accumulator model. We will guess that this is the best candidate for those fluctuations are the intrinsic fluctuations. The intrinsic fluctuations of the self, or we call the self signature, something like that. Like each one has a kind of a flow, a brain signature. I mean, somehow people have different, ongoing activity. I mean, when we try to predict, for example, diseases from the resting state. I mean, and in some cases we are successful, and in others specific situations we are not successful, and we are especially successful the more subjective these decisions are, because I mean that's correlative with the intrinsic activity, not with the external activity. I don't know what would you think about that.
I mean, I have a very specific idea about this internal. I mean, my PhD supervisor, Wolfgang Prinz, once wrote an article whose title was, "Why don't we perceive our brain states?" So we don't have a representation of our brain states. So the only type of representation that we have are afferent signals that result from our brain states. So I think we can't detect our brain states. So we can't really operate on our brain states. What we can do is detect, for example, some kind of muscle tension that result from our brain states in a way. And I mean, there is a quite interesting literature on these confidence judgments related to these supplemental primes. So participants in these supplemental priming studies, they can't tell that they saw an arrow pointing to the left or the right direction. But they can, in principle, detect incongruent trials when the arrow was pointing to the other direction. So if you ask them which trials were more effortful than others, they can do that, even though they're absolutely not aware of the signal itself. And my idea about it is that these trials induce conflict, and the conflict induces a kind of physiological state that people can identify. So they can indirectly use this state to infer that something is happening in their brain, so to say. So that's my idea about it. So as long as brain changes go together with physiological changes, people can use them for decisions or judgments or whatever. anyway. And I think this is also how brain-computer interfaces work. So if you feed back the brain state as an afferent signal, then you can use it to control the state. But this is a different issue, I think.
It's a great answer, because one of these references I cited about the athletes, they show that the ERP is coupled with breathing. It's manifest in the body again as a afferent copy. So I mean, I think it's a great answer. I'll shut up. I'm talking too much because I love your work, and I never had the opportunity to talk to you in person. I mean, this is not in person, but even though, so let other people speak as well.
Thanks a lot for your question.
Thanks.
Thanks.
We still have 10 minutes to our dead end. We said we would pick your mind for a long time, Marcel. Sorry about that, but you were advised. We told you about this. So one last question I want to ask: are we going to have to do away with manipulations altogether, or have we got a way for manipulating free will beliefs yet? Because I'm talking, of course, about the latest meta-analysis on this.
I think if we want to manipulate this to some degree, at least, I mean, whether we can really change free will beliefs, that's an interesting question. But if we want to manipulate, at least temporarily change them or affect them, I think we need to use other manipulations than these simple text messages. And this is something, you know, we are trying now in Berlin using virtual reality manipulations, where you really give people an experience in a specific context that they are in control or less in control. And I hope this way we are able to affect, at least in a specific context, these kind of beliefs. And I think that would be extremely interesting if that would work. And I'm optimistic because I'm not a gaming person, but if you talk to gamers in their game context, they accept a lot of very unusual ideas or contextual or situational constraints and take them for granted. So my hope is that by using this kind of manipulations, where you put people in a specific context, where they experience to what degree they have control over the environment and stuff like that, where you maybe even like people have done in these thought experiments, you can implement these kind of thought experiments in a plausible way. It would be possible to manipulate beliefs, and that would be great, because I'm still convinced that high-level beliefs strongly affect low-level social-cognitive processes in a way. And in this sense, I mean, you can investigate that correlationally, but as I said, this has limitations. So I hope that these kind of more effective manipulations will work.
Me too.
I will keep you updated, by the way. We will start soon with...
No, it's just because I talked about this earlier, about the problems we're seeing with manipulation, some replications and all this kind of stuff. And I referenced your work and the meta-analysis, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about it. That's why I
and honestly, also some of the stuff that we published, I'm not sure whether one could replicate it. I mean, at that time we were quite optimistic. We had very small groups. I think the stuff on the readiness potential that I did with Davide, we had 2 groups of, I don't know, 20 participants or so. Nowadays, you would presumably want to test at least 100 in each group to reach strong conclusions on that. So some of this stuff has to be replicated in a way, and then we will see. But I'm a little bit, and I mean, this is also intuitive, that these brief texts, maybe they prime something to some degree, but of course they don't lead to belief changes in a way. And in this sense, I think we have to try to come up with stronger manipulations of beliefs.
Thank you.
Renato, do you have
Last one?
do I have access to the Q&As, because it popped up another question from the audience, or do I read it?
Okay, all right, now I have it. Okay, so hi, congratulations on the lecture. Really very thought-provoking. I would like to raise a question for Professor Brass. My question is whether in all these experiments, such as those by Libet and the ones that Professor Brass carried out, there is not an intuitive tendency to try to find the specific moment when the decision takes place and then try to deduce it if it is or not conscious and therefore free, when perhaps we should understand human decision as a process and not an event, metaphysically speaking. Is being fully aware of the decision really necessary for free will? So that is it.
I mean, that is a little bit the point Walter wanted to make. And as I already responded previously, I think the situation, the Libet type situation, is quite artificial. I think in normal situations, I mean, decision situation, we have this moment where we think, oh, now I buy this car, or I don't know. But this is, of course, a completely different situation, as we also have discussed before. So, as I said, in the Libet type of experiment, these moments of conscious awareness are quite artificial. I agree with that. And we certainly don't need it. And for a lot of actions that we are carrying out, we don't need this conscious awareness. That's for sure. I mean, we run around the whole day long without making conscious decisions, in a way. And we function quite okay, I would say, most of us at least.
Okay, so Marcel, I think we only have to thank you so much for your talk, for all the questions answered. It's fatiguing 2 hours, but it's been fantastic. Thank you very, very much for accepting this. Hopefully, in the end of the year, we'll be able to meet personally everyone.
Yeah, that would be great to see you in Brazil again. But I would really love to be there. In a way, thanks for the invitation and giving me the opportunity to talk.
Thanks a lot, everyone. See you in the next session at 2 p.m.
We're gonna have Professor José Manuel Muñoz, and the discussant will be Leonardo Vicrota. We're shifting gears to a total different team, neurolaw. So, I mean, we're trying to cover all aspects of free will, decision-making, agency, and ethical implications. So, see you.